Hello and welcome to Get the Table, another wrestling roundtable discussion podcast with myself, Adam Wilborn, and the Dadley Boyz of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, here to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts where we review Raw, SmackDown, the Wednesday night war between AEW and NXT, pay-per-views, we have interviews, more roundtable discussions like this one, and a roundup of the week complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But as I said, joined by Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick. And gents, we are gathered here today via Google Hangouts to discuss missed wrestling opportunities. This is all off the back of the news from Eric Bischoff's 83 Weeks podcast, which is legitimately one of the best podcasts that isn't ours, all about Brock Lesnar almost going to WCW. They apparently turned him down whilst he was a rookie. So I want to talk about more missed wrestling opportunities. Before we do that, though, Michael Hamflett, your reaction to finding out the news that WCW said no to Brock Lesnar?
Not really a shock. The other podcast that's made a lot of discussion about Brock Lesnar's before WWE life as an amateur wrestler and a college standout is Jim Ross's. And he's a guy that was able to negotiate like for Steve Austin and The Rock and Mick Foley and Vader, and not just negotiate with bringing them in, but negotiate with Vince McMahon to suggest to bring them in the first place. He was just the man at the middle of all the moving parts of talent development when it was at its most crucial and all these huge names came in. It doesn't surprise me, not only that WCW said no, but that maybe even Brock Lesnar took a look and thought, well, maybe, but I'll take this meeting later on, or whoever he was with would want to also listen to Jim Ross's offer. And I can't actually see the timeline in which Brock signs for WCW because the industry just isn't set up to support that then compared to how WWE were just firing with everything. I can't have ever even seen it happening.
Yeah, for me, it's just yet another lol WCW moment. Oh, you didn't sign the next big megastar in all of professional wrestling, did you not? Well, of course I didn't. You're WCW. Yeah, it's one of those where at the time it was just such a systemic failure to build any new talent whatsoever that you just could never have believed that they would have taken him seriously or presented him anywhere near seriously. He could have swerved turned within the first fortnight of his run. There's just so many variable factors, and each and every single variable points towards failure because that's what WCW was by its grim dying days. And they would have put him in the natural born thrillers. They might have completely pissed off this guy with an incredible freak strength by making him do exhausting, debilitating drills, in the power plant. It would have been a disaster. It would have been a complete disaster as much as everything else was.
Well, talking a little bit more about missed wrestling opportunities, when I say that, Michael Hamflett, what is the first thing that pops into your head?
I can't get away ever from the constant failure of NXT call-ups not working on the main roster. I've never been one to just subscribe wholly to the idea that Triple H knows how to do it and Vince McMahon doesn't anymore, and that when Vince McMahon somehow disappears from this mortal coil, like anything's ever going to stop him, like Triple H will take over and make all this magically work. But I think Michael Sidgwick went off NXT long before Johnny Gargano started staring into his hands every week. We talked over the desks at length in the era before the Wednesday Night Wars about how the hope had disappeared from the old version of NXT, the hope that basically enhanced the golden years, the 2014, 15, 16 period of NXT, because the idea was, even though WWE wasn't an indie, you were watching your guys on a super indie and then you were excited to see them make it on the main roster. It was something that you would be able to talk to your friends about, or you saw them work in tiny little Full Sail. WWE fooled you into thinking that the likes of Bayley and Sami Zayn and Charlotte Flair and even the Ascension and teams like that were somehow the little engines that could. And then they get onto the main roster and they're just systemically destroyed by Vince McMahon's inability to, take care with characters, take time with characters, even the ones that appear on the surface like they're going to get over just fine. The likes of Enzo and Cass spring to mind. That incredible debut in which they obliterated the Dudley Boys. And then Enzo went on to incinerate people on promos week after week after week. Yes, he sounded like he was difficult in the locker room. And yes, they brought inexperience, which a lot of wrestlers weren't super keen on. But right there were an overact. There was comparisons made to the New Age Outlaws. And in old-fashioned WWE, it didn't matter that Billy Gunn and the Road Dogg weren't the best workers in the world. Their act and how over they were was far more important. And we saw that happen so many times with NXT, and then the main roster just let them all down. It'd be pointless to go through the examples. We said this before. It'd be pointless to go through the examples of the ones that failed, because it's easier to think that the ones that they made a success of. And by and large, it's the likes of Elias and Baron Corbin, who NXT fans were more than happy to see the back of.
You know what I've been arriving at conclusion-wise about NXT and the failure to successfully adapt it on the main roster? It's that NXT was simply too nice to exist in its peak, like in the WWE system. I think it's gotten a bit parodic. I know, like, ultimately, I'll do this on every podcast, and one day I'll stop, but today is not that day. The whole idea of moments and heart and soul of NXT, for me, it's reached levels of parody, but at the time, it was so life-affirmingly true. Like, someone like Bailey, I just can't scarcely believe that not only in pro wrestling as a whole, a character like her existed, but particularly within the WWE system, you had an earnest, dorky, completely endearing, wonderful baby face who was celebrated for that. I remember that there was a rumor that AJ Lee was buried for daring to celebrate the fact that she'd won a championship and marking it on her neck with a tattoo. That essence of that decision was pretty much Bailey's entire character, and it flourished magnificently on NXT. But the second you take it into the toxic corridors of Titan Towers, something like that just goes away completely. Something like Sami Zayn, he was almost fated to become a heel despite being the heart of the original NXT. He was almost fated to become a heel. Ultimately, I don't necessarily think it's just a creative problem. And that Triple H can market and promote talent way better than Vince McMahon can nowadays. I just think it's generally a company disposition problem as well as that. It's just contrived and built to fail, unfortunately.
Michael Sidgwick, when you're thinking of missed wrestling opportunities, are you thinking more recent or in the past?
A bit of both. I'll go to the recent first because it's obviously on the more the tip of your tongue and the edge of your brain. But right, I love Brody Lee's debut. I thought it was handled immaculately. I'm talking more about the promo than the lights out attack from behind because you can see the sausage being made and it was an unfortunate situation. I, in fact, pitched Brody Lee being the exalted one because I think there's a really neat parallel to be drawn between how much he was outcast by WWE, how much that fits thematically into what the Dark Order is in AEW. And I just like the idea that someone like him can legitimize this act. And there's a genuine in-character reason for him to form it, like outside of the umbrella of each company. So I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm all about the decision to have Brody Lee as the exalted one. I think it can do very good things for his career and for the act itself. But there's such a missed opportunity for Marty Scurll to have not led that group because the entire mythology behind that company existing, AEW, has so much to do with Marty Scurll, how he was in storylines because they were building towards something like this for a year, and we lived through it on being the elite, and we were desperate to see how exactly Marty Scurll would come back. He would clearly be a villain. They were writing him out of being the elite essentially with the express purpose of, oh, you've only got a year in that hellhole of ROH that we're all like getting away from. We'll write something brilliantly. We'll make you sympathetic in this situation, but we will then make you this big, huge heel when you come back because we're going to get ourselves over by being the saviors of pro wrestling in the meantime. I mean, there was so much narrative potential, and Marty Scurll understandably decided to take WWE main roster sized money and creative control. If you look at his contract and what ultimately led him away from AEW and just think of what a rich storyline, it's gone now, but never mind. But Marty Scurll, in terms of dates, money, and like everything else, he's on like one of those golden WCW Time Warner deals, and all power to him. And before everything unfolded, there was a slight glimpse that, to hardcore fans at least, this ROH stuff was kind of getting a bit of buzz back and a bit more to be interested in. But ultimately, this whole Wednesday night stuff has just completely overshadowed anything they have to do. So I think, dare I say it, it's almost a missed opportunity for Marty as well.
Yeah, really disappointing that we didn't get to see him as the exalted one. As much as I agree that Brody Lee is perfect for the role as well. It just, the whole sense, I mean, it all kind of makes a lot more sense now that the show at the end of December that everyone was really down on the Dynamite because, like you say, they planned for this wonderful huge reveal, and goodness knows where AEW would be now had that been pulled off. But like you say, the situation is as it is, and it's not the only person who we're going to get into, no doubt, in this discussion, who's in the wrong company. Before I come to you, Michael Hamflet, with one I really want you to explain about, because honestly, when the two of you told me about it, I was astonished. I want to very quickly mention the Nexus. I realize I mention this on most podcasts because Stu Bennett is, of course, my best friend. But it's inexplicable that they had such a group with such an impactful debut on the main roster. This wonderful strategy behind bringing these guys up from NXT and sort of protecting them from being too overexposed by their sheer number. And yet you can talk about SummerSlam and the decision for Team Cena to go over Team Nexus, and then, all right, maybe you salvage that storyline by bringing Cena into Nexus, but then he destroys the group from within and he will never turn heel because he's John Cena. And then in the end, Wade Barrett gets buried under a pile of chairs. I just really want to get that off my chest. But Michael Hamflet, one thing I really wanted you to tell me about is the fact that Kazuchika Okada was in TNA. What?
Well, TNA had a relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling, which sounds wild now. But if you were to go through the archives on TNA's quite difficult to navigate network, if you were to make the time to do it, you would find Kazuchika Okada, you would find Tetsuya Naito against the likes of AJ Styles and Nigel McGuinness. There are these matches that on paper look like dream matches, but then when you watch them, they're anything but. Okada was in a Lone Ranger mask. I believe it was called a Cardo or a Carde or Kato, maybe. I forget that. They used a couple of different names for him. Is that what it was? Yeah. And he was just reduced to being effectively a Japanese jobber that would either be an old-fashioned foreign heel or a sympathetic outsider as and when TNA needed him. These weren't necessarily even matches that took place on Impact. They sometimes went on the B-Show Explosion, or it was as part of an ongoing agreement that I believe that New Japan had with TNA regarding Wrestle Kingdom that I think probably Cedric could flesh out on. It created all sorts of havoc in the years that followed, because to this day, New Japan bosses have an issue with TNA based on how they treat their talent whilst on excursion. This was supposed to be an opportunity for the wrestlers to leave the dojo, go out and get some valuable experience, and then come back to New Japan fully formed as workers. Instead, when Okada returned and challenged Hiroshi Tanahashi, people laughed him out the building. It was only when he revealed himself to be this super worker in disguise that this was a booking revelation. Nobody in their right minds would have picked it based on what was an atrocious, abysmal run. Outside of New Japan, guys, even the likes of the Young Bucks were mistreated. TNA was a product that there was a lot to like about, but in terms of the way that they didn't see what they had at times, theirs is a roster that will probably be like full of the most regret of any in wrestling history.
Yeah, it's laughable what they did with Okada, because even if, right, you're not Gato, and a lot of people aren't, he was an actual visionary for spotting talent, and not only that, but to the second, to the date of the week, to the month, when they are capable of ascending and leveling up and becoming like genuine superstars. Like, not everyone has that visionary brain. That's what makes Gato a visionary. But ultimately, you have got a remit when you're working with any other organization. This is not just limited to wrestling companies working in tandem with one another. Like, have some respect for the other side. Have some respect for the other people you're doing business with, because it might end up completely biting you on the arse, and it did bite the arse of TNA. Like, all they had to do, if they didn't have the same visionary to see, well, this guy could be a real star, he can make some money for us, he could work some absolutely amazing matches that could help with our buy rates, which traditionally, I think, bar one pay-per-view, they just had the exact same base, and it wasn't very impressive.
Yeah.
Even if they didn't have the wherewithal to be able to see this, just don't make him a goddamn racial stereotype, thus pissing off the guys you're in business with, because it's ultimately an incredibly stupid thing to do. So I'm less kind of think, oh, well, you had Okada, you had Kazuchika Okada, how could you not see it? Because ultimately, the New Japan fans didn't see it at first. He had to wrestle a classic that everyone thought was a really stupid match to book. That first match against Tanahashi, they had to see it unfold in front of their eyes for it to become apparent. But ultimately, I will blame TNA for being just horrible. Like, generally just horrible. Like, oh, he's Japanese. What do I know about Japanese people? Well, I used to watch them on the telly. So that's what he can be. That's ultimately what it was. It was absolutely pathetic.
It is jaw dropping when you go back and look at it. What culture bingo right here. But I still remember doing the WCPW World Cup, and we had some phenomenal wrestlers in that tournament. Obviously, because Shida ended up winning the whole thing, and that was, obviously he's a sensational wrestler, and he had a wonderful match with Will Ospreay in the
Lovely
final.
hat.
But
Hats off to the bookers.
He, it's one of those where, regardless of what decision had been made with him and Ospreay and what have you, we wouldn't have brought him in and just have him play the like you say, the wacky Japanese stereotype. It's jaw dropping. I thought that was a good idea. Michael Sidgwick, one thing I wanted to ask you about is Cody Rhodes, because we talk about missed wrestling opportunities. Is it a missed wrestling opportunity for Cody Rhodes for WWE, or is it the fact that they would never have been able to do that in the first place?
No. Don't put that man's name in WWE's mouth ever again. Like, please don't ever do that, because if they didn't miss the opportunity, I'm about to walk through an alternate timeline in which I hate wrestling, all of it, and I don't want to do that. The irony about Cody, and this is why I admire him so much, is that when he left, like, I would hazard that not a single soul that wasn't related to him or a peer who wasn't intimately familiar with his work, I would generally hazard a guess that no one thought of it as a missed opportunity. Everyone thought, all right, he did some really good stuff in 2013. He's always been very committed and selfless in his character roles, but in 2016, with New Japan like developing its huge presence in the West, and NXT, the takeover events were starting to become arena size. There was a huge emphasis among hardcore wrestling fans on in-ring work and how important that was. And Cody, pejoratively, was given the nickname 3-Star Cody. They didn't think he was a great worker. They didn't think that he was a needle mover. They just thought, all right, well, good on him. He's left a system that isn't very good, and he's going to make lots more money on the independent scene. Let's see where that goes, I guess. So I don't think anyone would think of it as a missed opportunity at the time. I mean, it bloody well was. This guy is the CM Punk who's got more than rhetoric. He's a guy who's brought emotion back to pro wrestling, transcending any kind of lofty ideas of work rate with that Double or Nothing match. He's a guy who's the best goddamn babyface promo in years and years and years. He is genuinely, and Hamflet will absolutely hate this, for the amount of graft he puts in, for how he's reversed his perception, he is a total hero of mine. And even with that being said, I don't think it was necessarily a missed opportunity, because no one except himself believed in what he could do. And that's why he's so goddamn heroic.
Hamflet,
what have you got to say?
I didn't want to. I was just letting you get every single word out before coming back in. No, it's like genuinely with Cody, obviously. I mean, look, I hate to like have his own thing and have to say it, but of course, it's undeniable now what he's created or what he's helped create with AEW. Like Hunter Helmsley picking which bunch of friends to hang out with when he arrived in WWF in the Click. Cody made several really key good decisions really early on that transformed him and took him away from, well, ironically, took him away from someone like a Jack Swagger, and he became his employer instead. He saw the landscape and he saw the way it was, and he saw what he could contribute to that landscape. He was, to be fair, of stock that believed they could be better. Dusty Rhodes was never just a wrestler. Dustin Rhodes was, but you always felt he'd be somebody that'd stick around in the industry because he just deserved his place. Sidgwick hates the comparison I make to Jeff Jarrett, and that's because a lot of it is really flippant. But one thing I do think Jarrett and Cody have in common is a certain entitlement to wrestling and a certain entitlement to where they believe their position should be in it. And not all wrestlers have that. And I don't mean that as an insult either. I think that's something that there's a reason why Jeff Jarrett has remained in this industry when countless others that have been fired on television and are never going to work in this town again have managed to do it. Rhodes is currently far better at his role than Jarrett was 20 years ago. But I just think he's got the grit and the self-belief that he deserves this spot. So few wrestlers deserve anything wrestling. They're told that their entire careers. Cody Rhodes believes he's entitled to it and that he deserves it and has gone on to take that. And I think that's why those comparisons with the likes of Jarrett and Triple H are worthy, less so to do with the work, but more so just because of how they approach the entire industry. They look at it all and they think, well, I want all of that. I don't just want a small piece of it. And that's I don't think that's necessary in wrestling, in the cutthroat world of it. I think that's somewhat admirable.
Right, I should very quickly mention a few things that no doubt need mentioning here, although we've talked about them ad infinitum, so we're not going to get into too much detail. So, big wrestling missed opportunities, the invasion, of course, who ran over Stone Cold Steve Austin, and I really am disappointed with what they did with Vince McMahon's illegitimate son, especially when you find out about the ideas that they had behind it with Mr. Kennedy before it all sort of fell to pieces. But Michael Sidgwick, give us another missed wrestling opportunity.
I don't know if it's just because, in the absence of any new, really great wrestling, apart from AEW, which is absolutely handling the empty arena era with ease. No, I have been depressed by the idea of like where we are at right now. Even AEW, I felt some of the stuff they were doing was irresponsible. I can't go back to even the recent history thinking, well, that informs what's just happened now. And it's just, I can't get excited about something like Blood and Guts or even AEW as a whole for what's going on. But I've been going back to All Japan Pro Wrestling in the 90s to get my pro wrestling fix. I've been absolutely loving the work of Jumbo Tsuruta and Stan Hansen all over again, to the point where it's making me feel a little bit like Jim Cornette, because they're so big and hard and convincing and great at what they do, that to make me think, oh God, all these lads are too little. They do too many flips, just knock each other out. But on that basis, the WWF obviously did have Dr. Death, Steve Williams, a brilliant purveyor of the King's Road style in All Japan Pro Wrestling, and a great territory worker as well, obviously in Parallel. They had Dr. Death, and fair enough, he wasn't in his prime, but the idea for me is they wouldn't have let him operate as he did if he was in his prime. He was so stiff, he was so powerful that they would have asked him or told him to not be as snug regardless. So I think he arrived at the right time. That just completely did him dirty. If you say the words Dr. Death, Steve Williams to a certain pocket of the WWE fandom, they will think, what, that guy who got his arse handed to him in Brawl for All, who was like really old and he was there for about a whisper. That's what they'll think of. Realistically, he was an absolutely tremendous pro wrestler, so frightening, so intense, so unique with his offense that he would have made for an almost like scary opponent for Stone Cold Steve Austin, knowing what we did about his injuries in 1998. If they didn't, it's a work. The whole thing is, Wilborn, it's your favorite catchphrase, mate. It is a work. They could have worked and just given him an undefeated streak. They could have had Jim Ross, as they did later, talk him up as the most impressive physical specimen outside of WWE, coming to disrupt and change it in his own image. They had an absolutely fantastic worker who needed a mouthpiece, but who realistically could have been an awesome opponent for Steve Austin. And they decided to book him in a shoot tournament when he was pretty physically broken down, having endured the King's Road style of All Japan Pro Wrestling. Vince Russo was a complete idiot. Pamphlet?
Well, that's the start and end of every podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Dr. Death, Steve Austin thing, especially, I think, as you like mentioned there, Jim Ross, if there was a commentator that wanted that feud and those two men to get over more than anything else on the show, it would have been him. And I think he would have got it there. You would have had Dr. Death dropping guys on the neck every week, and then Jim Ross would have been able to talk about, that's possibly Austin's kryptonite. And you could just imagine the vignette where Vince McMahon is backstage drooling at Dr. Death, putting some goober away and thinking, there's my guy. That's the one. I've messed around with The Undertaker and Kane, and that hasn't worked. I farted on with Mick Foley, and that didn't work. Look at this absolute killer. He's going to do it. And fair enough, the way that like WWE's landscape was shifting so quick, the best they probably would have got out of Dr. Death at that age and time in his career would have been 1 or 2 pay-per-views tops. But just that era would have elevated that to dream match level. And Jim Ross is a soundtrack for it. It's the sort of stuff that it's almost hard to pitch it through the modern lens, because it would get screwed up on night one now. But things weren't getting screwed up on night one back then, unless wrestlers were going in the Brawl for All, in which about 6 wrestlers got screwed up and some of them never worked again.
Inexplicable, that entire tournament, just to feed Bart Gunn to Butterbean in whatever it was, 30 seconds.
Out of pure spite.
Right, be fair. I'll let Sidgwick sing the praises of AEW when it comes to Cody Rhodes. Michael Hamlet, you get a right of reply here. Did they miss an opportunity not signing CM Punk?
They did, but like right at that very moment, and then ever since then, not really. AEW, because it's a good wrestling show, now is in the position where the wrestlers need it more than it needs them. CM Punk, as similar to how Jon Moxley arrived at Double or Nothing, as a Dynamite debut or as a major pay-per-view arrival or something like that very early on in AEW's life would have been fantastic. It would have been a blockbuster story and another legitimate star in the way that they've maybe didn't appear to have some at the time. They're in the process of constantly building new stars, so that they'll need people like that far less than they did. But if you think about the fact that Jack Swagger, as Jake Hager, debuted on night 1 of Dynamite, they knew the impact of somebody with some name value could be worth something. So CM Punk is 100 Jack Swaggers, and the fact that there'd been a relatively cozy relationship between the two sides over, I think it was All Out Weekend with StarCast, where he'd done a pro wrestling tee sign, and I know it was in Chicago, and much like Punk's saying now how he works for Fox, he doesn't work for WWE, that'll be him just saying it was in Chicago, it wasn't in AEW. I get all that, but there was certainly a point where what they already had would have been tremendously enhanced by the mere presence of CM Punk's character and persona on television. He wouldn't necessarily need to nail his colours to the mast or what stable he was going to be a part of or who exactly he was targeting, but just his visual presence. They can't really go for someone like The Undertaker or Steve Austin or the names that WWE rely on, because those guys will look too daft in AEW. AEW's got to be seen. It's not just a youth movement, but it needs to be seen as more progressive and forward thinking. And a CM Punk that had been departed from WWE since 2014 was a progressive choice. Already, he doesn't really feel like that anymore. And at this point, if they got him, it'd more be for CM Punk's legacy than for AEW's. And I think that's a testament to how quickly AEW have reversed any of that old narrative of needing stars. But certainly, right around launch time, that would have been white hot. It would have been.
I've never wanted CM Punk to sign for AEW, you know, not once. I don't resent CM Punk. That's an obviously stupid and like harebrained way of looking at it, but I resent the mythology that surrounds CM Punk as this last great savior of professional wrestling, because he was obviously fantastic and I loved him. I loved CM Punk as a performer, but I hate this legacy surrounding him as the last great hope for WWE to have been any good, and that by extension, he was the last great hope for pro wrestling to be any good. I just never bought it. It was never for me. I've known that I've seen better matches in New Japan Pro Wrestling than anything he managed at Money in the Bank 2011. I've seen better promos than the Pipe Bomb since then. I'm sorry, I just have. I've seen better storylines than even the projected fantasy booking of the Summer of Punk. And all of this, a lot of it is wrapped up in being the elite. I think Kenny Omega's better. I think Cody's a better talker. I think that they actually changed the world where he used the word change and made a complete mockery of it, if I'm being perfectly honest. But he wanted to get paid, and that was the only place he could have got paid, and that's absolutely fair enough. And I just think, for me personally, it's not a missed opportunity that they signed CM Punk, because I would have hated their absolutely brilliant, hard-earned work to have not been stolen. I think they would have found a way to have him have accentuated it. But I would hate for Punk to have got the credit for the awesome work that AEW have done. I really would have hated it.
Well, James, we could talk about this for so much more. There's a numerous more that we will no doubt go into more detail at another time. But for now, let us know your thoughts on missed wrestling opportunities in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from for daily wrestling podcasts. Plus, you can let us know your thoughts on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. Watch there. Follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
You can follow Michael Sidgwick at
M. Sidgwick. Get it right this time.
Follow me at Adam Wilborn. Follow us all at WhatCulture WWE. This has been Get the Table. My thanks to the Dadley Boyz. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.